If you own a law firm and you're watching your consult calendar stay busy while sign retainer counts stay flat, this is for you. I am talking to law firm owners who have intake, conflict check, and follow-up processes that look reasonable on paper, but they still feel unpredictable in the real world. And I talk about all of this in my book because here's the moment that I see over and over. You finish a run of consults and it all feels solid. Great day. The prospects were polite, the facts were coherent, and nobody seemed like a tire kicker. Then you look at the end of the week and the sign retainer count does not match the number of consults. What's happening is you have a lot of retainers sent, you have a couple of maybe emails, and you have a few people who just simply disappear. They're ghosting you. And you start to think about maybe we need better leads, or maybe it's we need to follow up more. And both of those statements might be true, but neither one is the core issue most of the time. And I think this is where a lot of attorneys get this wrong. The central question is probably a lot simpler than you think. Why does a credible consult not turn into a signed retainer? Why does a consult not turn into a signed retainer? Well, most experienced attorneys default to one or two explanations when I ask them that question. Explanation one that I hear is usually external. Prospects, they're price shopping, the market is noisy, the competitors are louder, everyone's distracted. The second explanation I usually hear is an internal one. The intake team is not qualifying hard enough. The consult is not being run consistently, or maybe it's the follow-up is sloppy. And both of those explanations, they're real, but they miss what is actually happening in the prospect's head during that short window between the consult and when they give you a signature. And that's something to think about. I call that the retainer gap. And the retainer gap is the distance between a prospect agreeing with you intellectually and feeling safe enough to commit operationally. I mean, you can have a great consult and still lose the signature if the prospect experiences what I would call uncertainty at the exact points where they're trying to make a decision. And the retainer gap, well, it shows up as silence, delays, even requests for more time, and of course the classic line, which I'm sure you have heard over and over again, let me think about it. Yikes. Now, let me make this concrete with operational details because this is not a theory that I have. In a typical law firm, the sequence looks like this. Intake triage books the consult quickly, sometimes with incomplete notes because the phones are busy or they just didn't do a great job. And a conflict check is run, but it's rushed, or it's done after the consult is booked, so the firm is already committed to a time slot. The consult happens, and you think it goes well. Then the retainer is sent, and sometimes with a generic scope paragraph, sometimes with a fee structure that is explained verbally, but it's not reinforced in writing. Follow-up tends to be inconsistent because you assume the intake team is handling it, or the intake team assumes that you're handling it. So what happens is, like a week later, you have a retainer sent versus a retainer signed gap that no one can really explain without what I would say is guessing, which is not a good place to be. The hidden layer is that prospects do not experience your firm as one person. They experience it as a system. They notice when the intake person sounds different than the lawyer. They notice when the consult is confident, but the retainer email feels like a template and sort of cold. And of course, they're going to notice when you say something like, we'll get it to you by the end of the day, and it arrives 2 days later. They notice when they ask a question about timing and the answer is vague. Of course they do. And none of that means that you're doing bad work. It just means that the decision environment feels unstable to the PNC, and that's not a good place to be. The retainer gap is often created by small inconsistencies that you've trained yourself to ignore because you're focused on legal substance. Prospects are not evaluating legal substance, not at all. They're evaluating risk. So a prospect, they're asking themselves, will this attorney take control of a stressful situation without causing me any more stress or any new stress? And there are a few friction points that create the retainer gap, even when your consults are strong. Let's dive into those for a moment here. So first, the consult scheduling and consult show rate issues are often a signal, not a problem. If your consult calendar is packed, but your show rate is soft, that is frequently because the pre-consult confirmation is informational instead of stabilizing. So a reminder that repeats date and times is not the same as a message that reduces uncertainty. When people no-show, the instinct is to blame lead quality. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it is lead quality, but sometimes it's that the firm didn't earn the right to that hour by making the next step feel safe for the potential new client and the prospect. Second, the consult to client conversion problem is often a scope clarity problem disguised as a pricing problem. Lawyers, I know you hear things like, your fee is too high. And what a prospect means is, I don't know what I'm buying. I don't know how decisions are going to be made. And what happens if this goes sideways? Because if the consult is heavy on analysis and light on decision structure, the prospect leaves with information but not a path. And when that happens, that's just going to widen the retainer gap. The third thing that I see quite often is that conflict checks and handoffs can quietly poison trust. Because if a prospect has to repeat their story because intake notes are thin, you're just going to create doubt. And if a conflict check delay forces you to reschedule, you're going to create doubt. And when you as the attorney says, my assistant will send the retainer, and then it comes from a generic inbox with no context, you again create doubt. So these aren't like giant errors. They're just small signals that compound over time, and then they get bigger. So let me pause for a second. I want to let you know that I put a checklist in the description below. It's there to help you compare your consult to sign retainer flow against a few concrete markers like follow-up speed and retainer sent versus retainer signed. Make sure you check it out after watching the video. So let's get back to where I see most law firms make expensive decisions. It's when the signed retainer count drops, law firms tend to add activity. More leads, more spend, more networking, more content, more intake scripts. And what happens is that activity, it masks the problem for just a little bit. And if the retainer gap is the real issue, adding more volume is just going to increase the number of people who experience the same uncertainty points. You are just going to end up with more consults and the same number of signed retainers, plus a more exhausted team, including yourself. So what should a law firm owner do instead? Well, without turning this into a massive internal project, there are a couple of things you can do. Start with decision rules, not tactics. Decision rules, not tactics. So decision rule number 1 is if a consult feels good, but signatures lag, treat it as a trust and process alignment problem until proven otherwise. That means you've got to start looking at the handoffs, the timing, and the consistency of language from intake to consult to retainer delivery to follow-up. This isn't when you start looking for a new script. You're just looking to see if the experience the prospect has is coherent. The decision rule number 2 is that if the retainer sent versus the retainer signed gap is growing, then just stop debating lead quality until you can answer a simple question. Do prospects clearly understand the next step, the timeline, and who's responsible for what? And if you, as the attorney, can't answer that cleanly, I can guarantee you that your prospects can't either. That's the retainer gap showing up. And decision rule number 3 is that if you've got multiple attorneys and one converts and one doesn't, don't assume that it's charisma. It's usually structure. The converting attorney tends to create a cleaner decision environment for the prospect. They're going to set expectations about timing. They're going to make sure that the scope is clear, and they're going to make sure that the first follow-up feels inevitable rather than needy. And that's not a personality trait. That is just operational consistency that they've nailed. So notice what I'm telling you to do here. I'm not telling you to go change your website, let's go rebuild all your ads, or let's go chase a new channel to be on. Those, yes, can matter, but they're downstream. And when conversion is the constraint, it's upstream visibility that we need to fix, because that's going to be the uncomfortable truth that really shapes your internal experience, and that's not as consistent as maybe the legal work that you do. So the stakes here are bigger than a few lost matters. When the retainer gap persists, it changes how your firm acts. You'll find yourselves probably starting to maybe discount. Your intake starts booking anything with a pulse because they feel pressure to fill the calendar for you. And the case fit definitely gets worse. So what happens is the team spends more time on bad fit lead volume and less time on the matters that you actually want. And then you're going to get a second problem, because you're just going to get busy, but you're not building the practice that you ultimately want. And that's where there's like a quieter cost, because uncertainty inside the firm when it rises is not good. You're going to start questioning marketing. Marketing is going to start blaming intake. Intake starts blaming you. And no one is actually lying. Everyone is reacting to incomplete signals. And because signed retainers are the lagging indicator, you're going to argue about what's wrong. And this is how good firms drift into reactive decision making, which is not what you want to do. So a micro resolution looks like this. You pick one narrow conversion signal and you treat it as the truth source for a while. And for many firms, this is the signed retainer account tied to consults that actually occur plus the time to sign. So it's not clicks, it's not impressions, it's not even raw lead volume. And then you ask yourself, where does the prospect experience uncertainty happen between the end of the consult and the signature? And when you know that answer, you'll usually find it in one of three places: unclear scope, unclear timeline, or unclear ownership of follow-up. And I can tell you that if you tighten those up, the retainer gap's going to narrow. And it's not because you manipulated anyone, but because you really removed the questions that were stopping them from signing with you. You just made it easier for a reasonable person to make a decision to hire you. And if you're thinking, well, we already do follow-up, we already send retainers quickly, we already have an intake process, I hear you. I believe you. The point is not whether you do. The point is whether it feels like one system to the prospect. The prospect doesn't grade you on effort, they grade you on coherence. So the next time that you're thinking about this and you start saying to yourself, we need better leads, I would ask one question before you spend another dollar. Are we losing at the top of the funnel, or are we leaking in the retainer gap? And if this is the kind of information that you like learning about and solving at your law firm, I encourage you to like the video and subscribe. My name is Mark Apple, and I am the partner and founder of Forward Push Law Firm Marketing. I hope you found this valuable.